Hi, this is Ellen, and in this video I'm going to talk about how to use secondary sources to contextualise and support arguments. First up, I want to remind you what an academic essay isn't. It isn't, of course, a personal response to a topic. And if it isn't a personal response, then you're going to need to provide evidence to back up the claims that you make. In academic writing, you're not plucking ideas out of thin air, but rather you're building on the works of others. As Isaac Newton famously wrote, we see further by standing on the shoulders of giants. So, firstly, why do we need to refer to other people's ideas? Well, there are a number of reasons, not least that by referring to other relevant literature, you are demonstrating that you have knowledge of your subject area. Any argument that you make will involve having to situate yourself in relation to other people's ideas. You'll have to take a stand about what claims you agree with and where your own ideas deviate. But you can't just use any sources to back up your claims. Using sources which are not reliable and which are not relevant won't help your argument. In fact, instead, these will undermine your attempts to persuade your reader of your knowledge and expertise. But what then is a reliable source? And what is a relevant source? With all of the internet resources available at our fingertips, you might think that this makes the task of finding relevant and reliable sources easier, right? All we have to do is type some search terms into Google. Well, in actual fact, the sheer volume of material out there actually makes your task much harder. And more than likely, the majority of sources that you'll find in a quick Google search will be inappropriate. Would you consider a blog entry an appropriate source? Probably not. But why? Well, first, it could have been written by anyone, and there's no guarantee that it is anything more than opinion. But even if that blog entry had been written by a university professor, it doesn't necessarily make it reliable. The best sources in terms of reliability are published sources which have been through an editorial and preferably a peer review process. Reliable sources are objective and, like your own essay, will themselves be backed up with reliable evidence. Your university library homepage will be a good place to begin your search. Start by tracking down databases which are relevant to your field of study. And this leads me nicely on to the issue of relevance. Just because you found a reliable source does not mean that it's relevant. Supporting claims you make in a biochemistry essay with evidence you find in an academic journal article from geography in the 1950s is probably not a good idea. A relevant source is one that speaks the language of your discipline. A relevant source is also one that's appropriate to the level at which you are writing. Encyclopedia entries, for instance, may be perfectly adequate on some introductory level courses, but not nearly specific enough at more advanced levels. So, you've chosen sources you're happy with, but what now? How can you use them in your essay? Here I'm not going to talk about the nuts and bolts of how to integrate sources into your writing. Instead, I'm concerned with the bigger picture. How can you use someone else's essay to support your own argument? Well, firstly, an argument is convincing if you show you have knowledge of your subject area. So somewhere in the essay you're going to need to demonstrate this, and this will involve some sort of positioning. Usually, the introductory section of an essay is the place where you'll provide a survey of relevant research. Sometimes you might also have a literature review or a background section in which you can develop it further. In some disciplines, like English literature for instance, the whole essay functions as a literature review of sorts, where you carefully sift through relevant secondary sources and look at how these can help you to support the claims that you make. This kind of survey of relevant literature is necessary because it helps you indicate where you yourself stand. In order to have a standpoint, you need to have some foundations to stand on. When it comes to presenting secondary material as the foundations of your topic, then you have some choices to make. Will you, for instance, align yourself with this material? Or do you want to indicate a gap or a problem with previous research? One way to align yourself with research is to use a reporting verb that suggests this. To say that Smith hypothesizes that such and such is the case is very different from saying that Smith proves this to be the case. If you report the fact that Smith proves something, then you yourself are clearly convinced of Smith's claims. Note here the present tense. In many disciplines, it's common to use the citational present to talk about previous studies, and it's also interesting to look at the effect of doing so in terms of how you position yourself in relation to the source. Using the present tense can be a way of aligning yourself with the study. You are highlighting the nowness and the continued relevance of the findings. If you wrote instead, Smith proved that, the past tense might indicate that this is no longer the case. Though Smith's claims might have been regarded as proof in the past, perhaps more recent evidence has undermined the original claims. If you want to distance yourself further from the findings of a study, instead of writing something like, Smith's study was utter rubbish, you might write that Smith's study offered some interesting insights into current trends but failed to recognise the significance of the problem. As you will notice, there are academically sound ways of disagreeing with the findings of a previous study. You just have to be specific about the particular problems that you see without dismissing the work in its entirety. When it comes to using secondary sources to back up your claims, it's vitally important to explain exactly how it supports your argument. In other words, it's not enough to let the evidence speak for itself. Don't assume that your target reader will interpret the material in the same way that you do. Avoid leaving your argument open to misinterpretation.